All right, all right, all right. Oh, Strange and Awful History. Murat Halstead, 1902, Chapter 8. We're rocking and rolling. Oh, here we got another picture of some peaceful shit going on. One of the things that I always find interesting about a lot of this, like a lot of the old shit that Jason shows, like that there's a monorail video kind of thing from like 1902. A lot of pictures like in San Fran, New York, like after these it looks like there's no homeless people. It looks like everybody got bread, like top hats and suits and shit. I wonder if there's no homeless people because these photos are being taken inside essentially an empty city after a catastrophe, and there's no broke people left alive. Like maybe these people were just coming up from underground and just had all their bougie clothes and shit to unpack, because there's no, like, you don't see homeless people and shit in any of those photos. Like, everybody got money. But I wonder if that's like intentional too, like how, you know, you would do homeless people in photos nowadays for propaganda. Excuse me. All right, I'll shut up. Chapter 8, sorry. Coincidences and contrasts. Chapter 8. Between the Caribbean Sea Islands and the Mississippi Valley, earthquakes and agitations, the greater of all the quakes of the earth, the marvels of the New Madrid. Chapter 8, here we go. The recent disaster from the presence of a volcano of Martinique, the birthplace of Josephine, is the third that has been experienced and most severe. Indeed, it will stand out incomparable, not that the forces exerted exceeded all precedents, but the total annihilation of a city and the suffocation of all the people except for a few. Except of a few stragglers, surpasses precedences and the annihilation of tens of thousands of persons. St. Vincent has had the repute of being more intense than any other of the West Indies. It is the smaller of the volcanic islands. It was distinguished by an eruption in 1812. March 20, that had made an impression upon the traditions of the people. It's getting a little steamy in here. I'm in Florida, but we've had like a couple cold days. So I stay with a fucking sweater because I'm from up north. Everybody makes fun of me for my sweaters and shit. But then it'll get like warm, so. All right. This island has a sulfur pit, hence the term. And again, this was chapters ago and probably a long time ago, but that's what soufre means. The sulfur pit, the one volcano that they were worried about. And her volcano is Morne Goron. Height 5,000 feet. It is famous for a lake in the old crater, which is very deep, and the lava breaks through the side of the mountain. In the eruption of 1812, there was a savage shaking of Venezuela, famous for the overthrow of the city of Caracas, with the loss of people exceeding 10,000. This disaster holds a place not only in public report, but authentic history. The island of Martinique is purely volcanic, about 1/4 the size of Long Island. Area 385 square miles with 6 volcano peaks. The height of the taller Pele is 4,438 feet, and its situation is in the northwest corner of the island. The year of the greater agitations of the earth in the central region of the valley of the Mississippi was 1811, but they were noted earlier and later, especially in 1812, the year most formidable volcanic eruptions in the islands of Martinique and St. Vincent, until the recent frightful energies of the fiery mountains and shaking the earth and discharging mud, stones, and vapor in quantities, and all with fury unparalleled. Kaskaskia, in the territory of Illinois, was shocked at 3 a.m. January 8th, 1795. The Niagara Falls had a shake at 6 a.m. on Christmas Day, 1795. The quote-unquote site of Chicago had a considerable shaking August 24th, 1804, at 10 minutes past 2. 10 minutes past 2. That's a 201 in there. Huh. The Atlantic Monthly of November 1869 says of the site of the Chicago incident, quote, "It seems to have been quite a strong shock, though we have no accurate description of it. It was felt as far east as Fort Wayne, Indiana, nearly 200 miles distant. As with the preceding shocks, the impressions left upon the minds of the observers was that it came from the west," unquote. On the night of the 16th of November 1811, the Atlantic says of earthquakes of the western United States, there occurred a great long continued earthquake which shook a larger area than any known shock except Lisbon convulsions of 1755, and which in intensity was great, was in intensity was probably not surpassed by the movements which produced that great calamity. The thinly peopled condition of the region along the banks of the Mississippi, which precluded this great earthquake from producing any great loss of human life, has also made our accounts of the other phenomena very imperfect. This latter result is the more to be regretted, inasmuch as there can be no doubt that many of the events of that convulsion were without parallel in the history of earthquake shocks. The valleys of the great rivers of the world, at least the parts immediately adjacent to their banks, are rarely the seats of earthquake shocks of great severity. The Amazons, the Nile, the great rivers of Asia, even the Danube, the Po, and the Rhone of Europe, have been very slightly affected by earthquake shocks. The course of a great river, like that of the Mississippi, must be much affected by a severe earthquake. Without the intervention of external disturbances, the stream is constantly wandering over the plain through which its varying channel is cut. I almost want to read that whole page again. That's a lot. A slight accident, such as the sinking of a wreck or the lodging of a few sticks of floating timber, may so disturb the regular system of curves in which the water flows that the position of the banks in its course for miles below the point of disturbance will have to be changed before the equilibrium is restored. The sedimentary matter deposited by the overflows of the stream, which in the case of the Mississippi constitutes the great accumulation from 10 to 100 miles wide and many hundred miles deep. Many hundred feet deep. Like what? Through which the stream cuts its inconstant course, is not a compact mass, but in its structure frequently as loose and incoherent as artificial filling. That's like when Jason talks about like the earth and the ground and shit can have like this resonance or frequency that's so crazy or high pitched or whatever that like solid concrete can turn into quicksand, essentially. The settling, which necessarily takes place when the matter is consolidated by sudden and violent agitations of the mass, must greatly affect both the surface of the deposit and the course of the river, unquote. Fuck. I have bad coping skills. Sometimes, like, when I'm reading this shit, like, I wasn't able to do this as a child either. I don't know why I'm going on so many tangents today. As a kid, I could never do this. I remember being in, like, 8th grade, read something. I'd have a lady read it to me. Could not comprehend anything. There was no, I could read and shit, but there was no comprehension. Nowadays, like, when I read this shit, like, I'll start to sweat and breathe heavy and get stressed out, like I'm observing what I'm reading. It's kind of fucking crazy. All right, moving on. Sorry. The children born in the early years of the 19th century in the valley of the Mississippi throughout their lives remembered and referred to as the events had some occult occasion. The quote-unquote last war with England and the New Madrid earthquakes. No structure ever built by human hands for the habitation of the human race were better calculated to resist earthquakes than the original log cabins, built as pens with the logs fitted to each other firmly at the corners by chopping notches and hewing the ends of the logs sharply so that each was securely locked in its place. A log house of that type might be swallowed up in a fissure, but it could not be rattled down. Good to know. We quote again the very intelligent article of the Atlantic. Damn, that's been around. The Atlantic has been around for 138 years, at least. Or 100 and some years, the Atlantic. If that's the same newspaper that the politicians use today, that's fucking nuts. I guess it's not that nuts anymore. Owing to the fact that the region of the greatest observed violence was in the country immediately above the village of New Madrid, on the west bank of the Mississippi, about 50 miles below the mouth of the Ohio, this earthquake is commonly known in history as the New Madrid shock. But the evidence leads us to suppose that the true center of the shock was actually further west. The first shocks were evidently not vertical at New Madrid, but seemed to come from some point beyond the line of the most western settlements. The Indians described even more terrible effects of the convulsions in the region between the Mississippi and the Great Plains. Forests overthrown, rocks split asunder, and other indications of great violence than were observed at any place near the river. Everywhere the first movement seemed to come from, to the west, so that we are obliged to refer to the origin of this earthquake as that of many other earthquakes of the same area, to some center of disturbance lying between the Mississippi River and the Rocky Mountains. Now that population is spreading over all that region, we shall doubtless yet know, possibly by sad experiences, that the true seat of several disturbances, of which we have evidently observed only the westward prolongations. Quote, the first movements of the shock of 1811 were observed by parties of travelers on the Mississippi River. It occurred at about 2 a.m. and was exceedingly violent. We are so fortunate as to have from the pen of an English traveler, Mr. Bradbury, a botanist of some celebrity, a clear account of occurrences of that night and the several succeeding days, during which his voyage towards New Orleans carried him through the disturbed region. We quote Mr. Bradbury with one note of his point of observations. This traveler was sleeping in his boat, which was moored to the bank of a small island just above the point known as the Devil's Channel, near the Chickasaw Bluffs. This point is about 150 miles below the village of New Madrid and without the center of shock. Quote, in the night I was awakened by the most tremendous noise, accompanied by an agitation of the boat so violent that it appeared to be danger of upsetting. Before I could quit the bed, or rather skin, upon which I lay, the 4 men who slept in the other cabin rushed in and cried out in the greatest terror, "Oh mon Dieu, Monsieur Bradbury, c'est qui là? C'est qui là?" It's French. I'm not French. I passed them with some difficulty and ran to the door of the cabin, where I could distinctly see the river as if agitated by a storm, and although the noise was inconceivably loud and terrific, I could distinctly hear the crash of the falling trees and the screaming of wind foul on the river, but found that the boat was still safe at her moorings. More good news. This is a good news day so far. All right. Now there, we are looking at Theater of Saint Pierre, which companies from Paris have played. Okay. Another back alley shot. I was followed out by the men and the patron, still in accents of terror, inquiring what it was. I tried to calm them by saying, "Restez-vous tranquille, c'est un tremblement de terre." Calm down, motherfuckers. I bet that's what it says. Which they did not seem to understand. By the time we could get to our fire, which was a large flag in the stern. Oh shit. By the time we could get to our fire, which was a large flag in the stern of our boat, the shock had ceased, but immediately the perpendicular banks, both above and below us, began to fall into the river. That'd be some scary shit. Began to fall into the river in such vast masses that as nearly to sink our boat by the swell they occasioned. And our patron, who seemed even more terrified than the men, began to cry out, "Au mon Dieu, nous perons." I wished to consult with him as to what we could do to preserve ourselves in the boat, but could get no answer except, "Au mon Dieu, nous perons," and "Allons à terre, allons à terre." As I found Mr. Bridge the only one who seemed to have retained any presence of mind, we consulted together and agreed to send 2 men with a candle up the bank in order to examine if it had separated from the island. Jesus. A circumstance that we suspected from hearing the snapping of limbs of some drift trees which were deposited betwixt the large margin of river and the summit of the bank. The men, on arriving at the edge of the river, cried out, "Venez à terre, venez à terre," and told us there was a chasm formed already so wide that it had been difficult to pass it and attain firm ground. Immediately after the shock, we noticed the time and found it was near 2 o'clock. It was now nearly half past, and determined to go ashore myself after securing some papers and money, and was employed in taking them out of my trunks, when another shock came on, terrible, but not equal to the first. Morton, our patron, called out from the island, Monsieur Bradbury, suavez-vous, suavez-vous." I went ashore and found the chasm really frightful. It was not less than 4 feet in width. Besides the banks, it had sunk at least 2 feet. I took the candle and examined to determine its length, and concluded that it could not be less than 80 yards. That's basically a football field. And where it terminated, the banks had fallen into the river. I now saw clearly that our lives had just been saved by the mooring to a sloping bank. Like I said, good news day for these guys so far. Before we had completed our fire, we had 2 more shocks, and they occurred during the whole night at intervals of from 6 to 10 minutes, but slight in comparison to the first and second. I had already noticed that the sound which was heard at the time of every shock always preceded it by about a second, and that it always proceeded, from the same point and went off in an opposite direction. I now found that the shock came from a little northward of east and proceeded to the westward. At daylight, we had counted 27 shocks. Jesus. So from 2 a.m. to sunrise, basically. 27 shocks during our stay on the island, but still found the chasm so that it could be passed. The river was covered with drift timber and had risen considerably, but our boat was still safe. Whilst we were waiting till the light became sufficient for us to embark, 2 canoes floated down the river, in one of which we could perceive some Indian corn and some clothes. We considered this the melancholy proof that some of the boats we passed the preceding day had perished. Our conjectures were afterward confirmed, as 3 had been overwhelmed and all on board had perished. I gave orders to embark, and we all went aboard. Our conjectures were... I gave orders to embark, and we all went on board. The men were in the act of loosening the fastenings when a shock occurred nearly equal to the first in violence. The men ran up the bank in order to save themselves on the island, but before they could get over the chasm, a tree fell close to them and stopped their progress. The bank appeared to me to be rapidly moving into the river. Shit. December 16, 1811. At 24 minutes after 2 o'clock a.m., meantime, the first shock occurred. The motion was quick, oscillating of rocking by most persons believed to be from west to east, by some south to north. Its continuance, taking the average of all the observations I could collect, was 6 or 7 minutes. January 3rd, 1812. Slight vibration between 2 and 3 o'clock a.m. Quote, from the 3rd to the 22nd, no vibration strong enough to attract general notice occurred. And it was generally believed in Cincinnati that the earth hereabouts was quiet. Others, however, assert that they felt many slight agitations, which undoubtedly was the case, for during that period, shocks were every day felt along the Mississippi. Quote, 23rd, about 9 o'clock a.m., a great number of strong undulations occurred in quick succession. They continued for 4 or 5 minutes, having 2 or 3 quick exaggerations during that time. An instrument constructed on the principle of that used in Naples at the time of the memorable Calabrian earthquakes marked the directions of the undulations from southeast to northwest. This earthquake was nearly equal to that which commenced in this series on the 16th ultimo. Quote, 27th, at 45 minutes past 8 a.m., a solitary heave as strong as any single throw on the 23rd. March 3rd, a few slight rockings about 30 minutes past 6 a.m. March 10th, a stronger vibration about 8 o'clock p.m. The 11th, a slighter vibration between 2 and 3 o'clock a.m. April 30th, a moderate agitation. May 4th, about 11 o'clock a.m., a slight shock. May 10th, about 11 o'clock p.m., a slight shock. June 25th, in the night, a slight shock. 26th, about 8 o'clock a.m., slight agitation. September 15th, at the dawn of the day, a moderate vibration. December 22nd, about 3 o'clock, another. March 3rd, 1813, about 10 o'clock p.m., a very slight shock. December 12th, between 10 and 11 o'clock a.m., another. December 12th, between 3 and 4 o'clock p.m., another. The scientists rank the New Madrid quakes with Lisbon shock, and those convulsions stood alone as the greatest of which there was record until the Krakatoa outbreak, and that of Mount Pelée in May 1902. It will be noticed that the Mississippi earthquake was coincident in the shakes of 1812, with those in that year that occurred in Martinique. The grandfather of President Roosevelt, with his wife and children, passed through the New Madrid, Mississippi River phenomenon in the first steamboat, the construction of which he had superintended at Pittsburgh. This was to ascertain whether the great rivers of the West offered openings for steamboat enterprise, and Mr. Roosevelt reported favorably and built and navigated the first boat. The Western Journal in 1850 said in an article, quote, "Submerged lands of Mississippi," unquote. The earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 proved very injurious and disastrous to the south of Mississippi and was felt far and wide. They changed the course of the streams and rivers, which occasioned the waters to spread in every direction and made land where it was low previous, and elevated places sunk them, thus causing the rivers and streams to overflow at a great extent of the country. The earthquakes of 1811 and 1812 are still remembered by many of our oldest settlers. When the whole land was moved and waved like a wave of sea, and the majestic oak bent his head to the ground like a weed, and the terrible fact that the waters of the mighty Mississippi, opposite to the town of New Madrid, rolled upstream for 10 miles, carrying on them bosom barks, keel boats, and every species of crafts with rapidity unknown and causing destruction of property and life. The New Madrid shocks were felt as far as the shores of Lake Michigan and St. Clair to the north, and the Atlantic on the east, and the Gulf of Mexico on the south. Nothing is known of the distance west that the shocks were felt. The quaking came from the far west. All right. Chapter 8 coming up next. But isn't it interesting that we got like the War of 1812, right? And at the same time we're having this war, we're just also having one of the greatest natural disasters in like, any kind of recent memory. So I think that's kind of interesting. Jason says that all of the Civil War photos that we have, like everyone in existence, there was only like 3 or 4 photos originally, and everyone that we got came from some lady's greenhouse, like in Baltimore, or her garden house or some shit. Very, very sus. Very, very sus. All right, chapter 8 coming up next.